Racist cop attacks, black teen in broad daylight. What his father does next will leave you speechless. Sometimes, you don't need to make a mistake to be punished. You just have to be a black boy, running alone in the dark, and that's enough to become a target. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Rain had just cleared from the late spring sky. The scent of damp earth mixed with rising asphalt steam created a stifling, heavy smell. Night winds threaded through the rusted fence of the old community center on the outskirts of Atlanta, a place no one called a center anymore. People just referred to it with phrases like overgrown field or abandoned lot. But to 16-year-old Albert Carter, this place was salvation. It was the only place he could run, without asking anyone's permission, just to exist. No earbuds, no teammates, no cheers. Only the dry, steady rhythm of his breathing, ticking like a clock, and the splash of water beneath his worn-out Reebok soles. His dark sweatpants were soaked up to the knees. His gray hoodie clung with sweat and rain. Albert ran every night, quietly, like a shadow. He avoided peak hours, avoided stares, avoided the presence of anyone who might ask, "What are you doing here at this hour?" Because Albert knew he was the only black kid on the running team. Also, the only one who was never called by name when groups were assigned. The only one who had to carry a signed note from the coach just to be allowed to train after 6 p.m. The only one who got told, "Stay away from the fence near the West Side homes. Don't go into the parking lot alone. And remember, no hood up." No coach ever said those things to the other students. Albert didn't need long explanations. He felt it each time a mother pulled her child off the track as he passed. Each time a patrol car slowed down, windows rolling down. Not to speak, just to stare. His name was on the list for the upcoming district meet, and a sports scholarship to Georgia State University awaited if he could break 4 minutes 55 seconds in the 1,500-meter run. But no one ever told Albert he wasn't just running from poverty. He was running from prejudice. There was one thing he'd never told anyone, not even his mom, a night shift nurse who worked until 3 a.m. at the downtown hospital. He never played music when he ran, not because he liked hearing his heartbeat, but because he needed to hear if someone came near, needed to catch the sound of tires sliding through puddles behind him, needed to spot headlights shining from a distance. It was a skill, and it was fear. It was 9:12 p.m. The field lights flickered dimly. His smartwatch blinked. 4 minutes 58 seconds on the last lap. Not enough. But he didn't stop. He pushed through another lap. Sweat mixed with rain rolled down his chin. His ankles burned. But Albert didn't stop. He imagined graduation, his mom's face when she saw her son accepted into college. A life where he wouldn't have to lower his head every time a police cruiser passed by. A life where his skin wasn't treated like a sentence. When Albert finally stopped, he placed his hands on his hips and bent over, gasping for breath. A cold wind swept by. He turned around to scan the empty field. Still. Quiet. Everything seemed peaceful. But just seconds later, headlights flared in the distance, and the sharp screech of tires over wet gravel cut through the darkness. He didn't need a close look. He knew that car, the white Ford Crown Victoria, bringing with it questions that didn't need answers, and verdicts that never needed a trial. And this time, it wouldn't be just a stare. The police car glided silently into the training field, like a predator stalking its prey. No sirens, no speakers, no warning. Only the headlights cutting straight through the darkness, landing on the silhouette of a boy, gasping for breath in the middle of the track. It was 9:18 p.m. Albert hadn't yet recovered from his final lap when he heard the tires grinding against the wet gravel. A small sound, but to him, It echoed like cold metal scraping pavement. The white Ford Crown Victoria stopped about 20 meters away, its engine still growling, as if deciding which direction to pounce. The passenger door opened, then the driver's side. 2 men stepped out, their shadows stretching long beneath the lone floodlight behind the bleachers. One was tall, broad-shouldered, his crew-cut hair almost entirely gray. Derek, the man whose eyes always said he thought he was the law. The other was shorter, wearing black nitrile gloves, a twisted grin fixed to his face like a rubber mask. Edsel, known around town as the Night Gatekeeper. Albert stood still. Slowly, his hands lifted from his hips, palms turned outward toward them. It was the stance his father had taught him. Avoid sudden movements, keep your gaze respectful, and never, ever run. Though his heart pounded like war drums in his chest, Albert slowly stepped toward the stone bench, maintaining a safe distance and speaking as calmly as he could. "I just finished running, officers." Derek didn't answer right away. He stopped and scanned Albert from head to toe, like he was inspecting stolen goods. "Got ID?" he asked, voice cold, clipped, emotionless. "No, sir. I live 3 blocks away, near Rose's Market. I usually run here after practice. My coach permitted me to use the field," Albert said, steadying his voice to hide the tremble. He wasn't lying. Coach Williams had signed the permission form. It was just at home. Albert had been running here every night. Since last October, he'd logged 41 training sessions on this field, tracked by GPS and his smartwatch. Derek gave a small nod, but it carried no trust, more like the punctuation on a verdict already decided. Edsel tilted his head, licking his lower lip. "I think I remember you. You were stopped at that gas station 2 weeks ago, right?" he asked. Albert shook his head. Clearly, no. But Edsel didn't need an answer. He only needed an excuse. Derek stepped 2 more paces forward. "What's in your pockets?" he asked, his hand resting on the belt, just under 3 centimeters from his standard-issue Glock. "Just my phone, keys, and student ID," Albert replied slowly, each word chosen with the precision of someone walking a minefield. But it wasn't enough, because he had already been assigned a role. Not an innocent student, but a suspect worth searching for. "Take it out," Derek said, his tone as cold as forged steel. Albert didn't move. "Sorry. I was taught not to reach into my pockets during a stop." "Oh, now they've got their own rules," Edsel laughed, patting the car door, his eyes never leaving Albert. "Next, he'll be asking for the right to speak his mind." A flash cut through the night. Not lightning, but streetlight reflecting off polished metal. And Albert knew the moment of shift had come. The moment where words were no longer part of a conversation, but merely a pretext to act. He felt his body tense like a drawn bowstring. No longer a runner, no longer a student. In their eyes, he was now just a shadow with dark skin in the wrong place at the wrong time. Enough to suspect, enough to cuff. In the distance, a stray cat darted across the fence line, its small noise like the drop of a pin. But it would be the last sound before everything spiraled into violence without cause. Albert didn't know it yet, but in the next second, he would no longer be standing. And what began as just another night of training would become a haunting that would never leave the rest of his life. In the moment, Albert was still trying to hold on to the calm his father had taught him. The world that had seemed silent around him began to collapse, not with noise, not with warning, but with violence disguised as justice. "Hands up," Derek said coldly. But before Albert could lift his arms, the officer's hand had already seized his left wrist like a steel clamp. He had no time to react before Derek's other hand shot into the pocket of his hoodie, and yanked it hard. The phone dropped to the wet concrete, and the sound of it shattering made Albert's heart tighten. It was the old iPhone his mother had bought secondhand at the electronics market for $180 after working 4 extra weekend shifts at the hospital. The screen splintered like a spiderweb, and to Albert, it wasn't just a device. It was his only connection to the world beyond. "I didn't do anything," he shouted, his voice nearly choking. But Derek didn't care. He twisted Albert's arm behind his back and yanked hard, jerking his shoulder backward. The sound of joints cracking rang out as if something had been ripped from its socket. Albert buckled, his knees hitting the rough concrete, and that was when the first blow landed. Not a punch, but Edsel's knee slamming straight into his right ribs, making him gasp in agony. Then a boot to the stomach, knocking the air clean from his lungs. His chest felt like it had a ton of bricks crushing it. Edsel shoved his head into the mud, one hand gripping the back of his neck, and sneered. "What's the rush, huh? Planning to run? Don't worry, you're not going anywhere now." No one on the field, no cameras, no witnesses. Only the night sky and cold ground bear witness to the nameless torture. Albert didn't fight back, not because he didn't want to, but because his body couldn't. His breathing was ragged, pain piercing from his abdomen to his shoulder. In his mind were images of his mother, Loretta, working the night shift, and his father, Baron, who once taught him how to breathe when being restrained, how to stay alert in chaos. But no one had taught Albert how to endure the fury that wore a badge. Blood began to flow from his mouth. He could taste the sharp metallic tang on his tongue, mingled with the scent of mud seeping into his eyes, nose, and ears. The soles of boots scraped across the back of his hoodie. Each jab meant to erase his very existence from the night. Every time Albert tried to move, his arms were wrenched further, pinned to the ground like his body was living evidence that needed to be destroyed. After nearly 2 minutes of torment, 2 minutes that felt like an endless nightmare, Derek stood upright. He dusted off his hands, exhaled sharply, then turned to Edsel and said, "Nothing on him. Probably one of those coach-approved night runners, huh?" Edsel scoffed, spat on the ground, and said, "He'll know better than to come near here again." They walked off as if they had just handled a wild animal in the woods. No reports, no warning, no incident record. They didn't call for medical help. They didn't ask if he could still breathe. The police car backed out of the field, as if it had never been there, leaving only tire marks embedded in the wet gravel, and a boy sprawled out on the cold ground. Albert no longer screamed. He didn't cry either. Any tears, if there were any, had already mixed with the rain and blood. His body trembled softly, one eye swollen and purple, his shoulder dislocated, and the smartwatch on his wrist, the only evidence left, kept ticking time. 9:24 p.m., 6 minutes since he'd stopped after his run. 6 minutes to turn from an innocent student into the target of senseless cruelty. To them, who he was didn't matter. He was just a silhouette running in the dark, and that was reason enough to bring him down. The front door of the house at 1241 Hollow Creek opened at 9:47 p.m. Light from inside spilled onto the porch steps, illuminating a kneeling figure, a teenage boy in a torn hoodie, his neck twisted, his face streaked with blood and mud. Loretta Carter, 42, an emergency room nurse with 17 years of experience, a woman who had stitched up drug dealers and saved the life of a woman stabbed 5 times at a bus station, had seen hundreds of blood-soaked cases. But when her eyes landed on her son's face, his swollen eyes, torn lips, and crooked arm, she was no longer a nurse. She was just a mother whose veins had been ripped open by pain and fury. "Albert," she whispered, barely believing what she saw. He didn't respond. He simply let out a soft groan and collapsed into her arms like a kite with its string cut. Inside the small house with walls stained by time and the scent of cheap air freshener masking the damp, Loretta laid her son down on the couch. Her hands, once steady with gauze and antiseptic, now trembled as she pulled the hoodie off his body. Albert's back was covered in bruises. There were clear boot prints. 2 knuckles were swollen and purple. Most of all, his left shoulder, completely dislocated. Loretta turned on a flashlight, examining every spot carefully. "Don't move," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. She used a clean cloth, disinfected the wounds with hydrogen peroxide, then wrapped gauze around his chest, where the bruising on his ribs was deep. "Albert, what happened?" Her voice broke. He swallowed hard, eyes shut tight. "The police! Derek!" "And Edsel," he whispered. "They didn't say anything. They just hit me. Like I wasn't even human." Loretta froze. That name. Derek. She'd heard it at the hospital. An officer who once compressed a young black man's spinal disc just for not stopping at the crosswalk. And Edsel, the one paramedics called the guy who loves snapping wrists after someone's already down. She shot up from her seat, blood rushing to her face. But then she stopped, her eyes turning back to her son, lying in pain on his side. The anger was swallowed back, because she knew. Right now, Albert didn't need her rage. He needed someone to believe him. As she adjusted the bandage on his shoulder, he whispered, guilt thick in his voice. "I did everything Dad told me. I didn't move. I didn't talk back. And I even raised my hands. But," she gently touched his cheek, "it's not your fault. It's never your fault." The truth was, Loretta had warned him 100 times. Don't go out after 6 p.m. Don't wear a hoodie. Don't wear black sneakers. Don't carry a big backpack. Always have an ID on you. Be careful. Always be careful. But tonight, she realized something bitter. Caution wasn't armor. It was just a thin sheet of paper against the blade of prejudice. She walked to the landline. She was going to call 911. But her hand stopped midair. Who would come? The police? A doctor? A colleague of the men who had just beaten her son? Or a system that would say, insufficient evidence? Loretta pulled her hand back. Instead, she grabbed her phone, opened the camera, and began taking pictures of every injury. She noted the time, the lighting, the locations, even the shattered pieces of Albert's phone. Everything, every millimeter, would be documented. In that moment, a plan began to form in her heart. A quiet fire. Not just to seek justice for her son, but to force everyone to face what they'd been trying to bury for years. Loretta wasn't a lawyer. She had no reputation. But she had 2 things: the heart of a mother and the fury of a woman far too familiar with the bodies a broken system leaves behind. And now, she would not stay silent any longer. Loretta drove Albert to the community clinic at 7:12 a.m. Sunlight streamed through the windshield, falling on her son's bruised face, forcing her to look away and grip the steering wheel as if she could crush the helplessness swelling in her chest. She didn't dare take him to the hospital where she worked, because there she knew the names of doctors who had refused to file reports for black victims. Instead, she chose a private clinic in Fulton County, more than 9 miles from home. At the reception desk, the staffer glanced at Albert's swollen face, then wordlessly slid a form from beneath the counter and placed it on the desk with 2 fingers. No greeting, no eye contact, as if handing over a contaminated sample. Loretta filled out the form, attached her son's Medicaid card, and sat doused in a row of cold plastic chairs. They waited 2.5 hours, Not a single apology. The doctor finally appeared, a white man in his early 50s, wearing a white coat stained with ink around the pocket. He flipped through the file, skimmed it, and nodded. X-rays. Basic examination. Not once did he ask, "What happened?" Not one sign of empathy. 15 minutes later, he spoke in a curt tone, without even looking up. Fracture on the 8th rib, swelling around the left shoulder blade. Several deep contusions on the lower back and thighs. Nothing life-threatening. Loretta's breath caught. She grabbed the edge of his coat and spoke, each word distinct. "I want you to document this as a case of police assault. I need an official medical report to file a complaint." The doctor looked at her, as if she'd just asked him to fabricate evidence for a felony. "I'm not authorized to record police assault without instruction from an investigator." He set his pen down on the desk. "You can include that in your submitted complaint. But from a medical standpoint, I only document injuries, not causes. So, who do you say broke my son's ribs?" Loretta nearly shouted. "The body can be injured during sports," he shrugged. "I'm sorry." Loretta understood. The report had been neutralized before she ever walked in. In the eyes of this system, a wounded black boy would never be considered a credible victim. They went home in silence. Loretta spent the afternoon photocopying documents, emailing the Black Community Council for Justice, BCDCJ, and a civil rights lawyer she remembered from a conference last year. In return, she got a voicemail. She didn't stop. But the next morning, at 8:25 a.m., just as Loretta was changing clothes to take Albert to meet the lawyer, there was a knock at the door. 2 uniformed officers stood on the front steps, one white, the other Latino. The first officer spoke clearly. "We've received a report that a student named Albert Carter is storing illegal substances in his locker at Lincoln High School." Loretta froze. "Excuse me?" She stepped forward, shielding her son like a human wall. "We're just following protocol," said the second officer, his hand already resting on his radio. "There's a student search order. If needed, we'll coordinate with the school to open the locker." Albert stepped out from behind his mother, face pale, lips tight. "I haven't even been back to school since the beating. How could they find drugs in my locker?" he asked, eyes wide. Loretta understood instantly. They didn't need a reason. They only needed a pretext. A pretext to bury the complaint, to discredit the allegation before it could breathe. They closed the door. But to Loretta, that door marked the last time she let anyone else lead. From this moment on, she would not ask. She would strike back. In a damp, cold wooden cabin nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, where only the howling wind sliced through the pine trunks and the firm footfalls of men who had once stared down war-echoed, Baron Carter was leading a Level 4 survival course for a group of PTSD veterans. Dressed in a weathered military jacket, he held a raised relief topographic map, instructing while keeping an eye on the ravine below, where the trainees were practicing how to build snow-resistant shelters. At 49, Baron was a rare blend of rigid military discipline and meditative stillness. A former Delta Force commander who had led 9 classified operations in Syria, the Balkans, and Yemen, he wasn't just a soldier, he was a living legend in military circles. But for the past 3 years, following an unannounced retirement, he had chosen to retreat from the world's chaos and return to the mountains, teaching men like himself how to breathe again. After war. Then the call came from Loretta. Through the weak forest signal, her voice trembled but burned with fury. Albert was beaten. It was the police, Derek and Edsel. He said nothing, just held silence for 8 seconds. Then the call ended. 30 minutes later, he folded the map and packed it into a worn backpack alongside a Lenovo ThinkPad T14, military encrypted, with no standard IP registry. He signaled to his assistant, Training's paused. I need to go. Rain had begun to fall. Despite the muddy mountain roads, he pushed through nearly 14 miles to the nearest bus stop, caught a ride to Asheville, then flew overnight on a commercial flight to Atlanta. On the connecting flight between Charlotte and Hartsfield-Jackson, Barron activated a pocket-sized encrypted Wi-Fi device, using leftover access credentials from his final days at the Pentagon. His first login was to the internal database of the Atlanta Police Department. What he found made his fist clench. The name Derek Holtz showed up with 7 official complaints between 2018 and 2023. Among them, 2 filed by minority families, one involving a 14-year-old student, the other an Uber driver, had both been automatically dismissed due to insufficient evidence. 4 times complaint records disappeared from the system within 48 hours of being submitted. Edsel's file was slimmer, but signs of cover-up from superiors were obvious. Footage from patrol cams was stored for less than 72 hours, most of it unavailable. Barron gritted his teeth. The system wasn't broken. It was designed not to find wrongdoing. It wasn't just 2 rogue officers. It was an entire apparatus protecting them from accountability. What struck him hardest was a cross-entry log between the police database and the city's Board of Education. A coordinated response had been issued at 5:17 a.m., just 8 hours after Loretta had taken Albert to the clinic, requesting access to the student file of Albert Carter, along with a recommendation to inspect the student's locker under suspicion of prohibited items. Barron knew precisely what this meant. They were constructing a case before his son had the chance to speak a word. When the plane landed at 6:42 a.m., Atlanta was still blanketed in fog, but inside him, a storm was already brewing. He wasn't returning as a grieving father. He was returning as a commander, re-entering a battlefield, this time without a uniform, without a unit, but armed with every strategy and steel nerve forged through surviving hell. Barron stepped through the airport doors, dragging his weathered backpack behind him, his eyes not meeting anyone's, as if he already knew exactly what target he was going to strike. At Juvenile Detention Center 14A on the southern outskirts of Atlanta, a steel door slammed shut at 10:03 p.m. Inside cell 117, Albert lay curled on a bare metal bed, blood soaking through the faded white of his shirt. The facility didn't call this incarceration. They called it behavioral management for student misconduct. But in truth, it was an extended arm of a punitive system disguised as education. He had been taken in earlier that morning, charged with resisting an officer and possession of school-related narcotics. No hearing, no guardian notification. A temporary transfer order was signed by an officer named Harold McVeigh, the same man who once led a unit sued for wrongfully detaining a Latino student for 19 hours without water. Here, Albert was isolated. No phone calls, no lawyer. And most importantly, no one believed he was innocent. 3 staff members oversaw the unit. A bald man named Mitch, once suspended for shaking down candy from delinquent kids. A large woman named Mary Lou, infamous for psychological torment via overhead lights left on all night. And the last, Carl Benson, had been personally recommended to the system by Officer Derek. It was Benson who kicked Albert in the side that night. "Who do you think cares about you?" he growled. "Cops want you silent. School's already sold you out. Your mama's probably asleep, doesn't know you're coughing blood." Then he laughed. But someone wasn't asleep. At 9:56 p.m., a silver-gray SUV was parked 70 meters from the facility, beneath high-voltage power lines. Inside sat Barron Carter, dressed in thermal-resistant gear, infrared goggles, and rubber-coated gloves. Before him was a thermal map of the entire detention complex, pulled from civilian satellite feed and filtered through a custom-coded program he had once used for hostage rescues in Aleppo. Barron didn't wait for the legal procedure. He had no faith in buildings filled with empty files. He chose the path only those who've been crushed by the system dare to take. Rescue by his own hands. At 10:04 p.m., he stepped out of the vehicle and launched a 50-meter radius EMP device, plunging cameras, security lights, and gate tracking into total blackout. Instantly, he plugged a jamming module into the facility's main data port, halting all outgoing signals for 6 minutes and 42 seconds. Just enough time for a professional exfiltration. He slipped in from the north, scaling a rusted chain-link fence. A guard dog detected movement, but was instantly distracted by a synthetic scent decoy, a tool from his former Special Ops medkit. The door to Sector C opened with a code from the outdated system he had hacked the day before. 8846 number sign. No one inside believed anyone would dare walk in through the front. When Barron stood in front of cell 117, the clock read 10:09:13. He didn't kick the door. He placed a homemade magnetic device on the lock, twisted it twice, and clicked. The door opened. "Albert," he called softly. From the darkness came a voice, thin as thread. "Dad, is that?" Then silence. Barron stepped inside and lifted his son with the same arms that had once carried wounded teammates from the rubble of Bosnia. Albert was thinner than he remembered, lighter, and so weak he couldn't stand. "We're leaving," he said, his voice like stone. The hallway was empty. The air smelled of mold, bleach, and blood. Barron darted through 3 corners, reaching the east exit door, but a warning light flickered on. Someone had rebooted the system. Time was gone. He threw a dispersal stun grenade, not lethal, but enough to short-circuit the grid for 12 seconds. The alarms screamed like sirens of an ending world, but father and son vanished into the night, as if they had never existed. That night, news outlets reported a brief power outage, caused by rodents chewing on wires. No official mention of a break-in, no acknowledgement of Albert's detention, and of course no one knew the system had just been pierced by a father, a soldier, a man with nothing left to lose. Inside a wooden cabin deep within the pine forests, nearly 80 miles from Atlanta, the fog still clung to the window pane, even though it was already noon. Wind whispered faintly through old timber slats, but inside the small room, there was only the sound of heavy breathing, the dripping of filtered water, and the uneven heartbeat of a father tending to his son as though stitching back the pieces of a soul torn apart. Barron leaned over to disinfect Albert's wounds. The thin rubber gloves did little to hide the trembling in his hands, not from fear, but from pain. Every bruise, every scrape, every swelling on his son's body was a silent indictment, accusing the very world he had once served and believed would protect boys like Albert. Albert didn't speak much. He was exhausted, but his eyes no longer looked dulled. He had seen his father come through hell to bring him back, and now he knew. Silence was no longer an option. The next morning, at 6:42 a.m., Barron opened his old ThinkPad T14 laptop, connected through a private TOR network, and activated a dual encryption program he had once developed during his years at SOCOM. On the interface appeared 3 labeled channels: Vox Americana, New Justice Collective, and Blue Watch, Human Rights Observatory. He transmitted the full set of files, internal logs from the detention center, blurry video, but clear audio of screams, stomping boots, and a woman's voice saying, This one needs to be taught a lesson. Audio from a meeting between Edsel and a legal advisor, with Edsel's voice clearly stating, "He's the only black kid in the group. Don't tell me there's no reason." School record edits. 4 overlapping alterations made between 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. on the same day Albert was assaulted, with no signature from an administrator. And finally, the original medical report, never made public, with a note photographed by Loretta. Fractures caused by external blunt force trauma, inconsistent with sports injury. Additionally, he uploaded the entire archive to a hidden server located in Iceland, secured by triple-layered whistleblower protection protocols, to ensure that even if the system tried to erase it, the truth would survive somewhere. Inside the cabin, Albert turned on his phone for the first time since living in the shadows. The screen was still cracked, but the signal was strong. He opened Reddit, Twitter, Instagram. His name was everywhere. An 18-second clip from the internal footage had been posted online, captioned, "This is what they did to a kid who just ran. Justice for Albert." Within 6 hours, the video had amassed over 3.8 million views. The hashtag #Justice for Albert trended in the top 5 on US Twitter. On Facebook, a group called Color Truth Alliance announced it would provide free legal support. But not everyone was supportive. Some commented, "Running is a sign of guilt." Others said, "Don't believe edited footage." A few conservative accounts called for restoring order and demanded a background check on his mother. Albert read every line. He breathed slowly, but he did not flinch. Barron looked at his son. After a long silence, he asked, "If they reach out, offer a lawyer, offer money, ask you to stay silent, what do you choose?" Albert raised his head. His voice wasn't loud, but every word rang like metal striking stone. "I don't need silence. I need justice." Barron nodded softly. He understood. This fight was no longer his alone. It was no longer a personal mission. It was a signal bell for a generation being forced into silence. 1 week after the storm, on social media, in the press, and in the hearts of a nation boiling with outrage over the story of a black boy who was arrested, beaten, and silenced, Albert Carter's name appeared for the first time before the public, in his voice, at a place where people like him are rarely heard. Courtroom 6B, Redstone Hall, Atlanta City Hall. That morning, the courthouse grounds were packed. Over 40 journalists from major outlets like CNN, NBC, and ProPublica, as well as independent channels such as Broken Truth and the Justice Channel, crowded the entrance. A sea of people held up signs bearing numbered "Justice for Albert." Many wore shirts with his bruised face printed on them, beneath the words, "You tried to silence him. Now, we all hear him." Inside the courtroom, beneath sterile ceiling lights and walls yellowed by time, Albert Carter, 16, sat at the center. He wore a white shirt, a loosely tied black necktie, and faced 3 judges and 4 prosecutors. His eye was still bruised, his lip still cracked, but he sat upright. He did not bow his head. Attorney Monique Vargas, appointed by the Human Liberty Fund to represent Albert, stepped forward. A black woman in her early 40s, her braided hair neat, her eyes sharp as lasers as she stared directly into the camera lens. In her hand, she held an audio recording extracted directly from Barron's storage device. "Before you judge my client," Vargas said, "listen to the voices of those who did this." She pressed play. The room filled with sound. "Just pin him down. They're all the same little punks." Edsell's voice, taken from an internal meeting at the juvenile detention facility, 3 days before the rescue. No one breathed. The courtroom fell into a silence heavier than any chant ever shouted. Monique continued. Not once, not by accident, but as a system, it repeats itself. When your skin is darker than the marble in this place, your every action is assigned meaning. Criminal, rebellious, dangerous. Then it was Albert's turn. He was called to stand and testify. His voice trembled at first, but it did not break. Each word landed slowly, like nails being driven into wood. I'm not here because I committed a crime. I'm here because I was turned into one before I could even speak. Because I ran. Because I'm black. Because they didn't think my father would come back. But he did. And now, I'm here too. A woman in the second row burst into tears. A reporter lowered his camera and didn't press the shutter. This was no longer a hearing. This was a declaration. A declaration that no one, no matter how young, no matter how dark their skin, can be erased by a single blow, a fake report, or a wrist twisted by the roadside. When the hearing ended, a CNN journalist described, the air cracked like after a silent explosion. But no one fled. They stood. And they clapped. It wasn't applause for a courtroom victory. No ruling had been made. It was applause for someone brave enough to speak the truth, in the very place that once tried to turn him into a ghost. Outside the courthouse, Barron leaned against a wall, never stepping in front of the cameras. He didn't need to say anything. He simply watched his son step into the crowd, his steps no longer shaky, but proud, like a warrior raising his shield in the heart of ancient Rome, among those who once dismissed the worth of his flesh and blood. 2 weeks after the historic hearing at Redstone, 3 unprecedented events unfolded simultaneously in a city long accustomed to treating forgetting as a survival mechanism. Officers. Derek and Edsel were suspended indefinitely, facing charges of assaulting a minor and filing false reports. The Office of the Mayor of Atlanta ordered a full investigation into Police Precinct District 3, where at least 19 internal complaints had been archived without action over the past 3 years. And for the first time, a 16-year-old student was invited to speak before the Georgia State Human Rights Committee. But Albert Carter did not return to school. Not out of fear. Not out of shame. But because he understood, his battle was no longer inside classroom hallways. It now lived in the minds of thousands of young people teetering on the edge of breaking. Instead of attending classes every Monday morning, Albert launched a blog. Its name carried no fury, no blood, no gunfire. The blog was called Running Toward the Light. Each post was a slice of truth. The first told of a morning sprint in the rain, where every step crushed a layer of doubt. The second showed his cracked phone screen, captioned, "They thought this was a weapon. I used it to tell the truth." The third, which went viral, was a letter addressed to other kids who had been pulled over, asked for ID, or followed in stores, simply because they didn't look like they belonged there. Within just 5 days, the blog reached over 270,000 views. It was shared by organizations like Equal Justice Now, the NAACP Youth Chapter, and even drew an interview invitation from Trevor Noah. Loretta, his mother, became a consultant for a new initiative called Mother's Firewall, a digital network where parents could alert one another about police abuse, share student records, and connect with volunteer attorneys. It all began from the night someone knocked on their door and brought Albert home covered in blood. Barron never returned to Appalachia. He didn't take on another military mission. Instead, he began teaching again. Self-defense reflex training for youth in communities of color, guidance for parents on storing evidence, and how to write legal complaints that wouldn't be diluted. For him, the new battlefield wasn't the deserts of the Middle East. It was the tiled sidewalks of silent cities. One evening, after a simple dinner of beans, toast, and boiled radish, Albert stepped into the backyard. The Atlanta night was chilly. A fire flickered inside a rusted tin barrel. In his hand was the torn black hoodie, stained with blood, mud, and a nameless fury. No one stood nearby except Barron, watching silently, without a word, without a question. Albert took a deep breath, then held the hoodie over the flames. The hoodie burned slowly, each seam unraveling, each thread turning into smoke. No one called it a ritual, but it was a final act, to shed the role they once forced upon him. The runner, the suspect, the boy forbidden from being angry. Barron placed his hand on his son's shoulder. For the first time since returning home, the look in his eyes softened. Because sometimes, a father doesn't need to say anything, only be there to witness the moment his child is no longer buried in wreckage, but becomes someone who builds something new. And that fire burning in the dark of Atlanta wasn't just consuming a hoodie. It was incinerating an entire system that thought it could extinguish the truth with batons, handcuffs, and forged reports. But the truth, once ignited, never dies.